Welcome to Chapter 2, Physical Processes and World Regions. This chapter will discuss sort of the hard science side of geography and provide a good view of why I say geography is sort of a jack-of-all-trades science. You could describe the Earth as having four habitable spheres or environments: the lithosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, and biosphere. The lithosphere is what comprises geology. That's the rocks we walk on, the varying thickness, the tectonic plate activity, things of that nature. The hydrosphere would be the water involved, the oceans, lakes, rivers, what have you, and of course the abundant marine life within them. The atmosphere, of course, would be the gas above us, what we breathe, what the birds fly in, etc. And the biosphere would encompass all the biology in the lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere that exists. We are going to start our study of the processes of the world with geology. In this case, we're going to start with plate tectonics, or continental drift, a theory first developed by Alfred Wegener in 1912. He had the idea that the continents were at one point joined together in a supercontinent known as Pangaea, but that they slowly drifted apart over time. This theory was not accepted when it first landed because there was no mechanism as to explain how the continents could move. They're gigantic pieces of land, after all. How do they move? Eventually, geologists studied this concept and they discovered sea floor spreading, the process of plates moving away from each other. This is what the mid-continental rift system is in the center of the Atlantic. The Atlantic Ocean is slowly spreading out over time, thus causing the plates and continents that are touching the Atlantic Ocean to also move along with it. However, if the plates of the continents do not want to move with the ocean, they can butt up against it in what we call converging plates. This happens when one plate subducts under another plate. California is an example of this. The Pacific Ocean is subducting under California. Seafloor spreading doesn't do a whole lot besides make new crust. Converging subduction zone plate boundaries, they do a lot. Many natural disasters, if you know, occur at subduction zones, occur when plates converge. Earthquakes and volcanism being the main two. Again, look at California, that is an example. When plate tectonic activity happens, plates either moving adjacent to each other to strike slip or converging, again, as with California, you have seismic activity. The seismic activity comes from the vibrations released by the plates moving. These vibrations can result in earthquakes, volcanism, and if the plates are underwater, tsunamis. Earthquakes, you are familiar with. Nowadays they're measured at a magnitude scale, which is a direct representation of energy release. And as you can see from this brief chart here, very, very powerful earthquakes. If you want to look up the 1960 Chilean earthquake, you'll see massive amounts of damage have been done. As I said before, if an earthquake happens in the water, you tend to get tsunamis, tidal waves. I believe, Indonesian tsunamis that happen in the early part of the 2010s are a good example of this. And of course, you have all this activity going on underneath the ground. Volcanism tends to happen. The movement of the molten earth material around causes volcanoes to form, volcanoes to erupt, things of that nature. It's not a one-to-one comparison necessarily. There are other mechanisms of volcanism, but the ring of fire around the Pacific Ocean, which we'll get into in the next slide here, is a direct result of plate tectonics and seismic activity. Here is an interesting picture of many of the larger plates that make up the lithosphere of the Earth. As you can see here, circled, there's a Pacific plate which is expanding out, and this specific plate causes the ring of fire, as you may know about. We can look at here and we can see different fault zones. Red, yellow, blue, and green represent different ways the plates are interacting with each other. These interactions cause a variety of natural occurrences to happen. You can have ridges forming again throughout the Atlantic there, pushing the plates out, but then you have the Pacific also pushing the plates out. So what happens in North America? It's getting squished, right? You can see there, if you zoom in on California, there is an active subduction zone there. The movement of the plates has caused the Earth to form essentially in the shape it has. Mountains are formed this way. The Himalayas were formed because the Indian plate smashed into the Eurasian plate. And I also want to emphasize that there are lots of smaller plates than what appears on this picture, but again, that's going deeper into geology than is necessary for a class of this type. Here we can see a generalized cross-section of, we could argue, the Atlantic Ocean, with a mid-Atlantic ridge pushing out into continental crust, subduction, what have you. This picture is a good example of when I say geography is a jack of all trades. It's because each of the subdivisions, you could argue, that geography glosses over are much, much deeper than what is talked about. Here we're talking about plate movement, tectonic activity, seismic activity, things of that nature. So we're not going deeply into what causes the upwelling, what are the outer inner core, what is the asthenosphere, things of that nature, convection cells. We're not going to dive deep into those topics because that's not the point of the class. You need to go to take a geology class for that. But it all plays into the way the world works and the way the world looks and all the other aspects, all the other layers of the Earth, the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, all are directly related to what happens here in the lithosphere. Now we're going to transition away from geology into meteorology and eventually biology with patterns of climate and vegetation. When we talk about climate, I want to make it abundantly clear that there is a difference between climate and weather. The weather you see when you look outside the window is not necessarily the same thing as the climate that we talk about. Weather is what you get on the Weather Channel. It's your day to day. It's going to rain tomorrow. That's the weather for tomorrow. Climate is a description of the overall long-term picture, long-term look. The climate in a desert is different than the climate wherever you are, assuming you're not in a desert, even though it can rain at both places. Two different climates can have the same weather, but that is not necessarily mean there's a link between them. This class does dive a bit into climate change, so just to forewarn you. Forces that shape the environment and human interaction include many parts of meteorology: precipitation, aridity, seasons, climate and vegetation types. All these are work together, all these play with each other to form the world that we live in today. Likewise, as I said before, you will see tie-ins to geology going through meteorology into biology and then eventually the study of what the people do with this stuff. Any study of meteorology involves precipitation. Precipitation and temperature are key variables in weather and climate because precipitation is water, and water is, well, essential for life, right? We have discovered organisms that do not require sunlight, do not require carbon, but they always all require water. So what is precipitation? Precipitation can be defined as the result of processes that cool the air to release moisture. Precipitation, we think of it as rain, but snow, sleet, and hail also fall under that broad category. Here we have a world precipitation map. Notice, again, that this is a map that does not include cities, it does not include waterways, it does not name countries, anything like that. It does have a coordinate system, however, which is useful. What is this map trying to get us to understand? This map is trying to get us to understand where precipitation is most common. You can look at this map and you can see the darker green is directly, the darker the green, the more precipitation, or in most cases, the more rain you get. Anywhere from above 78 inches or 2,000 millimeters down to, well, no precipitation. Funny enough, look at this map, and I ask you, what is the largest desert of the world? You may think, well, the Sahara up there, that big piece of yellow at the top of Africa, that's large, right? You would be wrong. The largest desert in the world is actually Antarctica. Antarctica down there is blown up a bit given the type of map we have here, but Antarctica has next to no precipitation. It never really rains in Antarctica, making it the world's largest desert, even though it's covered in snow and ice, which is water. I know it's counterintuitive, but precipitation does not mean that there isn't water there. It means that there isn't water coming down. Our brief discussions of geology and meteorology in this chapter have led us to a discussion of climate. Climates are products of precipitation, temperature, latitude, and elevation. The climate of an area, in turn, develops the biome of the area. The two are directly connected. Biome, of course, being the terrestrial ecosystem categorized by the dominant type of natural vegetation. There are many different climate types, and within these climates, different biomes throughout the world. When I go over these major climate types, try to picture them in your head. Think, when I say ice cap, what are you picturing? What animals are you picturing? What plant life are you picturing? If you were to stand on an ice cap, what would it feel like to you? Also, keep in mind, what people do you picture when you do this, if there's any people at all? So, major climate types we're going to discuss will be ice cap, tundra, and subarctic. Those are clumped together for a reason, but they're not the same thing. Desert and subarid/steppe, again, picture that. When I say steppe, what are you thinking? What people are there? What plant life are there? What animal life is there? Tropical rainforest and tropical savanna. Marine west coast. What do I mean by marine west coast? Mediterranean. What do you picture when I say Mediterranean? I'll give you a hint. It's Mediterranean climate is not only found in the Mediterranean. Humid subtropical and humid continental. And of course, undifferentiated highland climate. That one you probably haven't heard of a whole bunch, but we'll get into it. Here we have a world climate types map describing the major sections or types of climates throughout the world. Take a few moments, pause the video, and take a good, solid, hard look at this map. Can you think of any explanations as to supposed trends you can see in the map? For example, desert. Where is desert located? Why do you think that is? Tundra. Where is tundra located? Why do you think that is? Rainforest. Where is rainforest located? Why do you think that is? Here we have a world biomes map. You're going to notice if you step back a little bit in the video, this looks eerily similar to the world climate types map. There are a few differences here and there, but biome and climate are intrinsically connected. Climate describes more of the weather and precipitation. Biome describes more of the biology of the area. But they both describe the world. Again, pause the video, take a few seconds, notice where prairie and steppe are. Is there any sort of rationale behind that? Notice where coniferous forests are. Is there any sort of rationale behind that? Take the moments, figure out what's going on this map. That will help you understand when we get into the specific regions of the world why they look the way they are and why the plant and animal life and human culture in general exists in the way it exists. Here we have examples of the various different biomes that exist on the Earth. We're going to start with an ice cap biome. As you can see, the ice cap biome is devoid of vegetation, except for very few spots where enough ice or snow melts in the summer to allow tundra vegetation to grow. This example is in British Columbia in Canada, and it looks barren, because it more or less is. Take a few seconds, skip back a little bit in the video, find all the ice cap biomes that exist on the Earth. Notice what climates they are, notice the latitude, longitude, try to connect these dots. Here we have an example of tundra from northern Norway. Tundra vegetation is comprised mostly of moss, lichens, shrubs, dwarfed trees, and sparse grasses. Again, take a few seconds. I'm going to keep repeating this point at each one of these. Notice where on the Earth this biome exists, what climate it is. Take a look at the countries. Think about your stereotypes of those countries, right? Where does tundra exist? How does it affect humans? How does it affect the creatures? How does it affect basically everything? Geography is all interconnected. Geography is everything around us. Coniferous forests consist of needle-leaf, evergreen, coniferous trees that can stand long periods when the ground is frozen, that depriving them of moisture. Coniferous forests occupy large areas of subarctic climate. Here we have an example from British Columbia in Canada. Notice the tundra example is also in British Columbia. British Columbia is a rather long province of Canada and can include both these seemingly disparaging climates. I keep saying it, I'm going to say it for every single one of these. Think about this area. Look at that. What animals are you going to picture? What humans are you going to picture? What are those humans going to be doing? The climate, the biome, is a very strong indicator of what you're going to have. Do you picture people farming in this soil? Maybe not, right? This is probably going to be more logging or hunting going on here. Maybe mushroom picking, things along those lines. Now we are going to jump latitude a bit and check out a desert shrub biome. Notice the complete lack of vegetation here. Somewhat rather similar to tundras, isn't it? Except where in a tundra you have large amounts of snow and ice, here you don't. Dry riverbeds are really the only place where desert shrubbery exists. This example from the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, again, brings to your mind certain images of cultures, of people, of animals, right? Take a few seconds. This should sound familiar. Go back, look at your biome and climate maps, find desert shrub biomes, look where they are, look at the countries that inhabit them, think about the cultures, think about the people, think about the industry, if you will, right? Take all that, coalesce it together. A steppe biome, here an example shown in eastern Turkey, is composed mainly of short grasses and can be referred to as a temperate grassland if you want. This may look familiar to some of you, right? This is short grasslands, sparse trees, usually hilly. When I say steppe, you probably think of Mongolian steppes, right? That's the most classic example. But a steppe grassland is not the climate and the biome of Mongolia. Again, go look at your map. Where do steppes exist? This is a rather broad term. What is a steppe sandwiched between? What differs a steppe from other climates and biomes we've seen before? Not a lot of vegetation here, right? How different is this from the moss and lichen example we looked at previous? Here in Dominica, in the West Indies, we have a tropical rainforest example. Tropical rainforest climate is rainy and occurs genuinely at low latitudes. Heat and moisture are almost always present in this biome. Take a good look at this. Think about where rainforest exists. What do you picture when you picture a rainforest? Are you picturing vast, sprawling cities and lots of farmland? Not natively, right? You're probably picturing, well, rain. The name rainforest kind of provides a hint to the amount of precipitation showed up in this biome. But look at the location of rainforests. What does that have to tell you about precipitation? Here we have a scrub and thorn forest in northern Zimbabwe. Does this look like a desert to you? Would you call this a desert? How would this differ from a desert? How would this differ from a steppe? Find these things in the map. Think about what you picture when you look at this in terms of vegetation, in terms of animal biome, in terms of human climate, things of that nature. Is this the Lion King here, or previous other examples of the Lion King? This savanna example from southern Kenya gives you a ruddy example of animal wildlife. In this case, we have zebras, right? Savanna vegetation, which has taller grass than a steppe, occurs in areas of greater overall rainfall and more pronounced wet and dry seasons. There is a perfect example of the differences between these biomes. They have noteworthy examples where you can distinguish them. Not all biomes, even though they may look similar, are similar. You got your latitude, longitude to take into account. You got what's butting up against them to take into account. You have the way humans interact with these climates that brings up the differences. Here in Southern California, America, we have a rather confusing looking Mediterranean scrub forest image. Mediterranean climates are characterized by rainless summers contrasted with cyclonic or orographic precipitation in the winter. We'll get more into what those mean as we go forward, but the important thing to note here is, what is this picture telling me about Mediterranean scrub forest, as opposed to what I think of when I think of the word Mediterranean, right? Here we have some higher elevation, perhaps. Notice part of this mountain is darker than the other part. Where would that darkness come from? Is that a forest on that mountain? What is it? You need to stop, you need to think about this information and how it pertains to what's going on. When you picture Southern California, did you picture a desert? Do you picture a city? Or do you picture something like this? A temperate mixed forest, here shown in central Missouri, is a transition area between needle-leaf coniferous trees and broadleaf deciduous trees. Even though this exists in central Missouri, that does not mean it's necessarily south of where we are here in the UP. Go back to your map. I keep saying this over and over and over again. Find temperate or mixed forest biomes. Look at the climates. Look at the areas. What's butting up against it north-south. Look at the latitudes. Stop, take a look at this picture. What animals do you imagine scurrying in front of this camera when this picture is not being taken? Right? What industry do you see going on in this area? What people do you picture working in these areas? Finally, we run into some undifferentiated highland vegetation here in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado in America. These have a range of conditions based on elevation and exposure to wind and sun. Numerous biomes are impossible to map on a small scale. And that is a perfect example when you take a look at this picture. Where the photographer is standing, you appear to have sparse grasslands and maybe even lichens on the ground. That sounds familiar from previous examples. Going off in the distance, it looks like we have lots of coniferous or needle-leaf trees. That sounds familiar, right? What is the elevation and what is the general location with regards to wind and sun doing to this biome? How does it affect precipitation? What do you picture when you look at this? Is this some place where you'd have mining? Is this some place where you have lumber? Do you have farming here? What animals do you have running through? I'm repeating these broad statements over and over again because it's an important aspect to figure out why human culture grew up, where it grew up, and how it grew up. We talked a lot about the different biomes, and I asked you to stop and think about the animal and plant life exhibited within them. And you maybe only thought of one or two animals, or one or two plants, but in reality, there are multitudes of species and genuses and families of biology in each of these biomes. That is indicative of the importance of biodiversity. Biodiversity, of course, being the number of plant and animal species present and the variety of genetic material these organisms contain. When I say biodiversity, and I ask you to think of an example, you probably think of the rainforest, right? Rainforest has huge amounts of untapped biodiversity. You have, literally thousands of different species of frogs in a rainforest. That is boggling to the mind, but it exists. The downside of biodiversity is the struggle to protect it. Human removal of, for example, rainforests or natural ecosystems depletes biodiversity. When the rainforest in the Amazon was on fire previously, or at the time of recording of this video, Australia's on fire, you have mass animal death. You have possible extinctions of animals, both known and unknown. Decreasing the biodiversity negatively affects the environment that we are talking about. There are some controversies surrounding the Green Revolution, if you will. On one hand, puts more food on the global table, but the result of increased farming renders crops more vulnerable to pests and disease. If you don't have biodiversity, if you don't have a variety of biology in an area, something that affects one thing affects a larger percentage of the overall biomass, right? Ways to combat these issues with biodiversity is the establishment of national parks and protected areas. Examples in America being like Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. Wild bison really only exist in national parks nowadays, in part to protect the biodiversity of those areas. Wolves up here exist mostly on Isle Royale in the UP. This is because it protects the biodiversity of the wolf as it is. Biodiversity hotspots exist throughout. If you have the opportunity to travel in your life and you're interested in this sort of thing, you can look up biodiversity hotspots and go to areas of the world that have plant animal life exclusive to the area. Madagascar would be an example of this. Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. That would be another example of a biodiversity hotspot. Places where you will see things literally unseen outside of a zoo anywhere in the world. Here is a map of 34 priority regions for biodiversity identified by Conservation International. When looking at this, these red spots are places of increased biodiversity importance that Conservative International argues needs to be protected for the general health of not only the area, but the world at large. I know I keep saying it because it's important. Go back to your climate, your biome, your other maps we've seen throughout this class, and again, in future videos, try to merge all these maps together in your head. What overlaps? Are there any predominant biome or climate regions that are tied with biodiversity? I give you a hint, not a lot of biodiversity going on in tundras, because there's not a lot of wildlife in tundras, and tundras don't necessarily have exclusive wildlife. But then also think about world events. Think about, again, the fires in the Amazon. Where were they? Where did they spread? The fires in Australia. Where were they? The fires in California. Where were they? Where did they spread? Think about your mineral resource extraction. Where are your large mines in the world? Chile is one of the largest copper exporters in the world. They are mining vast swaths of their land. Is that affecting the biodiversity? It may seem like a not important argument. Oh no, a couple species of frog died. But there is a greater impact not only for humans and the inability to see and experience the vast, wonderful nature that exists, but animals that are more useful to us may feed or interact symbiotically with species that if they go extinct can negatively affect them. There's a lot intertangled, and again, I'm going to say a lot. Geography is a jack-of-all-trades study. It's important to know how these different mechanisms and systems interact in regards to biodiversity and other things. But if you want to know more about these specific topics, you need to subdivide into study of these particular topics. We talked a lot about land biomes, but truth be told, land is a small percentage of the Earth's total surface area. Water comprises 71% of that surface area, and life on Earth would not be possible without the resources, both bio and mineral, in the hydrosphere, in the oceans, lakes, rivers, and ponds of the world. The World Commission on Water projects that by 2025, half of the world's population will live under severe water stress conditions. And you know full well how important water is. You use it to bathe, you use it to wash your clothing, you use it to obviously drink, right? Half of the world's population living under severe water stress conditions is ridiculous. And keep in mind, if humans are having that much trouble getting water, what about the animal and plants that can't necessarily move and haul their water around and run it through pipes, right? This sentence talks about human population, but it is much more severe than that. So, yeah, water shortage sucks, but why else should we care about the oceans? Well, as I said before, 70% of the world's surface is comprised of water, and oceans have the largest role in the hydrologic cycle. Seawater is converted to usable freshwater precipitation. When it rains on you, there's a good chance that rain originally came from the ocean, because there's a lot of ocean, right? The ocean also feeds us, right? 50% of the world's population relies primarily on fish as their source of protein. You go to places like Norway or Japan or the West Indies, something like that, fish is a primary source of their diet. Here, in the UP, we still eat a lot of fish, right? You go to Lake Superior and you can catch your dinner. Global demand for seafood has increased 40% since 1980. And remember, these slides are somewhat old as of the recording of this video in early 2020. That number has probably increased even more since then. The ocean, of course, will provide energy and raw materials for human use. There is a push towards tidal energy generation. It's in the works, but raw materials is a big thing. A lot of the oil that we use, that we convert to gasoline for our cars, is pumped out of the ocean. It plays an important role, of course, also in trade and commerce. 90% of global trade is seaborne. The majority of goods not made in the country you are in had to cross an ocean to get there. If you get anything made in any Asian country or European country or African country, there is a very high statistical probability it came over on a very, very large barge. Here we have an example from the famous Pike Street Market showing the biodiversity and the usefulness of the sea resources. The crabs here, crab legs, there's fish in the background. Lots of people come here, buy this stuff every day. And truth be told, you go to most any major city in the world, you're going to find a market like this, predominantly selling seafood. Although governments have been doing more in recent years to protect the Earth's biodiversity, atmospheric changes, i.e. climate change, have profound impacts on natural systems. These atmospheric changes are largely attributed to human activity. I know climate change is seen as a contentious issue on social media. In this class, we're going to stick to actual reality, where it is an issue and it is affecting literally everything on the earth. If you would like to argue this point, you are more than welcome to in the comments down below. But I'm just going to tell you, as the guy that grades your paper, you need to get your facts straight, man. Human activities are responsible for documented, I wish I would underline, documented warming of the Earth's surface. The IPCC, you may have heard that acronym before, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a United Nations-sponsored panel made up of 2,500 atmospheric scientists from 130 countries. In 2007, they concluded a report that said global warming was unequivocal, meaning it's happening. That's in 2007. You are still actively having this conversation and the recording of this video in 2020. That's crazy to me. That's absolutely crazy. This is not a liberal agenda. This is not a, fancy Hollywood actors in their mansions looking down on us for having plastic straws issue. This is the people that spend their lives studying this stuff telling you we have an issue here. Global mean temperature at the making of this slideshow has increased more than 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century. That may seem like a small tip of the scale to you, a degree and a half change, maybe more than that, whatever. But, again, look at those climate and bio maps. Think about the ice that's right on that verge, the ice caps that are sitting at a very warm latitude. So much so that 1.4 degree push up can start a melting process. These things can steamroll along. Results of human production of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, exhibit a lot towards this. And it's not just carbon dioxide coming from tailpipes of cars. It's more than that. It's chopping down rainforests to get grazing land for cattle in Brazil. Beef cows produce a lot of methane. If you know where methane comes from, beef cows produce a lot of methane. Methane also is a greenhouse gas. So you're chopping down the rainforests that give us oxygen to make beef that produces methane that is further going towards this cycle. And then, you polluting the oceans. I mean, it's Captain Planet was in the 1980s, and no one seemed to pay attention to him, apparently. Here we have a graph from 1880 to, again, 2011, the time at which the slideshow was created, showing a marked and accurate rise in global temperature and carbon dioxide concentration. Noteworthy here is these two grow together. As you have more carbon dioxide, you have more average global temperature. The two are synced. And as I said previous, CO2 is not the only gas you need to worry about. There are lots of factors in play for that global temperature, and a lot of those factors are directly attributed to man. An understanding of the greenhouse effect, gases such as CO2 causing a rise in global temperature, was first established as a concept way back in 1827 by Jean-Baptiste Fourier. If you know your mathematics, Fourier is a name you would recognize. He noted that the Earth's atmosphere acts like a transparent glass covering on a greenhouse, allowing visible sunlight to pass through and trapping some of the heat that tries to escape. In our atmosphere, naturally occurring greenhouse gases make Earth habitable by trapping heat from sunlight. The greenhouse effect needs to exist in order for the Earth to stay warm. Otherwise, the heat from the Earth would travel out into the solar system. You can look at other planets in our solar system that don't have greenhouse effects, don't have thick atmospheres, and look what happens to them. Concern over global warming focuses on human-derived sources of greenhouse gases, which trap abnormal amounts of heats. In particular, things we've discussed: methane, nitrous oxide, CFCs. CFCs are more or less banned in most parts of the world at this point, but the point still stands. The human-produced problems are causing greenhouse effects to run wild. Here is a visual to represent this greenhouse gas effect I talked about. Notice the solar energy coming from the sun. Solar energy hits the Earth, is absorbed by the Earth. Some of it eventually radiates back. Some of it bounces back in the troposphere, some of it bounces back in the stratosphere, and some of it radiates away into space. The problem is, the more greenhouse gas you have, the more bounces back. Buildup of greenhouse gases above the stratosphere, you see that there? The more that bounces back, obviously less that is released, obviously higher temperatures. The effects of global warming will continue to go and continue to get worse as time goes on. At the end of this century, we could be looking at a 3 to 7 degree increase in average global temperature. Not only is the temperature increase, but weather is also arguably negatively impacted. More precipitation overall, but also more pronounced drought. So instead of getting some rain and then some time without rain, you have flooding and desertification. Big difference there. The climate gets more extreme. Pronounced warming in polar regions. Ice caps melting, rising sea levels, no more Miami. Shifting biomes. If a biome shifts, humans can move around. We understand how weather works, we understand how climate works, more or less. Animals don't have this benefit. A shifting biome causes species extinction and agricultural changes. Suddenly, it's too cold for the trees in that forest to survive, or it's too warm for the bears and the foxes to survive. They die out. We don't want food sources dying out. Rising sea levels, as I said previously, and the real interesting aspect is when you have island nations that are losing their land population, you have large cities that are having issues dealing with sea levels, you have agriculture being highly diminished because of rising temperatures. What are the countries going to do at that point? Geopolitical instability. You're going to have infighting between countries that want to feed their populations. Here we have an image of an ice cap. Notice the polar bear. Polar bears live on tundra and live on ice caps. They do their hunting predominantly in the water for seals, fish, things of that nature. As these ice caps back up, the polar bear's natural ability to be concealed via its white fur is diminished. The polar bears aren't going to be able to hide from their prey well. The polar bears are not going to be able to feed as well. Polar bear populations start to be declining, start to have issues. These are tangible things that we're seeing right now in our modern times as an effect of ice coverage decreasing due to global warming and due to temperatures rising. It may not seem like a big thing. Oh no, a couple polar bears are going to be, starving. Oh no, the seals are going to live better. It's all a process. There's entire ecosystem, entire biosystem revolving around these ice sheets. When that goes, it has ripple effects. And again, I'm not talking about all the other things that go along with these ice sheets melting, the rise in sea levels and things of that nature. But hopefully, given this presentation, you can see how all these things coalesce, all these things come together to cause an issue, and how climate change and how global warming is a intricate part of understanding geography, understanding biomes, understanding things of that nature. So I've had lots of doom and gloom so far, right? Well, what can be done? First thing to notice is, well, on individual levels, you can do your part. You can turn off the lights at night. You can try to use more reusable materials instead of getting a new plastic bag every time you go shopping. Maybe take your own bag with you and fill it up. On a macro scale, China and the US account for 40% of global emissions, and India is right up there with them. So you need to have large-scale action being taken by countries in order to do proper mitigation of this process. That being said, at least in America, if the populace want something done, you can vote in people to do it. Approaches to confronting climate change. Mitigation. Switching from coal to cleaner fossil fuels to produce electricity. Natural gas burns cleaner and produces more energy than coal. Coal is an outdated source of electricity, simply put. Reduce energy consumption. The less energy you consume, the less fossil fuel, if your energy comes from fossil fuel, needs to be burnt to make that energy. Removing greenhouses from the atmosphere by boosting photosynthesis. What do plants do? Plants breathe in carbon dioxide, breathe out oxygen. At a very basic understanding of biology, that's what they do. The more plant life you have, the more of that negative greenhouse gas is going to be sitting in the atmosphere. Sadly, we also have adaptation to consider. Cope with and reduce the unavoidable impacts of climate change. Climate change is a big bulldozer driving forward. You're not simply going to stop it by yourself. Climate change is going to crest. It just matters on when it crests is the question. Building seawalls to prevent flooding due to rising sea levels. This is something that's actively happening on coastal cities today. Miami and places like that have to build seawalls and have to deal with this because they have very expensive hotels and condominiums on the beaches at risk. relocating people from flood-prone areas to higher ground. This is, again, something that's actively happening nowadays. You have to take people away from shorelines, put them someplace else, so that way they don't get flooded by the rising sea levels. The obvious problem with this plan, not everyone can move. It's not easy to move. That's not a solution. That's very much a band-aid. Develop crop varieties that are more suitable to expected changes in temperature and precipitation. That is a very interesting adaptation idea because it acknowledges the fact that the crops that we have, the crops that have sustained us through the entirety of human evolution, are going to die. If you know anything about farming, you ever have a garden, you know that certain crops grow at certain times and certain crops grow at certain weather conditions. And you can have frost hit and you lose all your crops sometimes. This will impact our food sources. This will impact meat, obviously. Comes from those crop varieties. It's all interchanged. It's all interwoven. It all is bundled together. Here this slide is an example of the age of this slideshow. So, examples of approaches to mitigating climate change, negotiation and implementation of international treaties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Here we have the Montreal Protocols signed in the late 1980s. The modern equivalent to this, of course, would be the Paris Climate Accords. As of the making of this presentation, the United States is withdrawing from these Paris Climate Accords, which are supposed to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted by the countries involved. It's kind of hard to fight global warming if you don't, on a nationwide scale, do something to fight global warming. Cut emissions through market-based incentives such as cap and trade or emissions trading. This is the idea that if you're going to pollute, you have to pay more to pollute. It's debatable the veracity of these techniques to mitigate climate change. And natural increases in carbon sequestration. It's a tough word, sorry. Natural capture and long-term storage of carbon in so-called carbon sinks, forests, farmlands, oceans, so that buildup of carbon dioxide atmosphere can be reduced or slowed. This is what I said previous, where what do trees do? What do plants do? They breathe in carbon dioxide, breathe out oxygen. The more trees you have, the more carbon dioxide is caught by them and the less goes in the atmosphere, creating that greenhouse effect. I think the Trillion Trees Initiative is something that is going on, again, at the time of the recording of this video. And it's good in theory. We'll see how the application works. But if we can find ways to not only reduce how much bad we're doing, but reduce the impact of the bad that's being let out, perhaps we can find some mitigation and avoid the disasters that are climate change. Thank you for watching this video on Chapter 2. I hope it was informative. Please feel free to leave comments and discussions down below. Discuss with your fellow classmates. Discuss with people that happen to wander on this video. You're only going to learn. You're only going to improve from it.